All right, so there's a lot going on in Texas politics. The Senate primary race that's going on. Let's focus on that. I know there's a ton of other races going on in Texas, but the talk of the town, the talk of the nation is this Texas Senate primary race. And the Republican side's been going at it with John Cornyn and Paxton going at it, but I think even garnering more attention right now is this primary between James Talarico, the state representative out of the Austin area, and Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman out of North Texas, out of the Dallas area. And so I would like to talk about two things. Number one is that there's been an incredible turnout in Texas. For the first time since the 2002 primary, we're seeing more people vote in the Democratic primary than the Republican primary. It's been 24 years since this has happened in Texas. We haven't seen this in that long. After 2002, all these elections in the primary, Republicans have dominated turnout. So is something happening? Yeah, absolutely. Democratic voters are showing that they're a lot more enthusiastic to go out and vote. The question is, are some of those voters that are voting in this primary voting for the first time, are they low propensity voters? We'd love to find that out soon after the election. Love to find out how many of those Democratic primary voters had previously voted in Republican primaries that turned over to the Democratic side. That could be really a gold mine of information going into the November election, midterm election, when the Democratic nominee, whether it be Talarico or Jasmine Crockett, when they run against a Republican nominee in November. And like I've mentioned, this primary election has been historic. It's been getting a lot of national attention. Here is a clip of a CNN analyst talking about the race.
Something is going on in Texas. Primaries are March 3rd. That's next week. There is a really interesting phenomenon happening, though, among who is voting. Let's get to CNN chief data analyst Harry Yetton. We're not even exactly talking about the candidates here, which is why it might be even more important.
No, mind blown. To quote the show Blossom, Joey, look at this. Share of Texas midterm primary ballots at this point in the cycle cast in Democratic primaries or Republican primaries. In 2022, the last midterm, overwhelmingly, the votes were being cast in Republican primaries, 62%. But look at what's going on now in the 2026 cycle. More votes are being cast on the Democratic side. What a shift from where we were 4 years ago at this point. More people in Texas picking up the Democratic ballot.
More Democrats are voting in Texas than Republicans. How unusual is that?
Just how unusual? Well, you see the massive shift from 2022, but look at history. Go all the way back. When was the last time that more people actually picked up a Democratic ballot, cast a ballot in a Democratic primary in Texas in the midterm? You have to go all the way back to 2002.
2002, like I mentioned, was the last time that we saw this happen. And so something is definitely going on now in terms of who's going to fare better against the Republican, whether it's going to be James Talarico or Jasmine Crockett. That is to be seen. But there's definitely an enthusiasm and a wave going into November of 2026 that either candidate could really take advantage of, right? And I think both of them are very talented young leaders, politicians, and the future of the part of the future of the Democratic Party. And it's super cool to see such talented crop of leaders coming up politically here from Texas. And it's unfortunate, I think, to a lot of people that they had to face each other off in this U.S. Senate race. I think some people were hoping for the talent to be spread out between governor and Senate and attorney general and things of that nature. But it is what it is. It's what we have. So I'd like to take a little bit of time to describe the way that I see the two different styles between Talarico and Jasmine Crockett, because arguments have been made by both sides about what style is most effective in beating the Republican in November. So outside of this incredible wave of activity and enthusiasm from Democratic voters, what is going to be the best strategy moving forward to defeat the Republican in 26? Now, there's been a lot of opinions out there, a lot of hot takes, a lot of emotion going on, especially on TikTok, people going back and forth about what the best style is. And so this video isn't about who's right and who's wrong. It's just sort of breaking down what their strategy and what the mindset is going into this race. Now, Jasmine Crockett is talking about expanding the electorate of non-traditional, low propensity voters within the Democratic base who aren't inspired by anybody but she thinks that she could inspire them because she's been willing to take the fight to MAGA and Trump like nobody else. And in many ways, she has been that figure nationally. And she already had the name ID going into this race because of that, because she's been this national figure that has been unapologetically going after the corruption and the disgusting politics that is going on, that is happening, that is being injected by MAGA and Republicans in Washington, D.C. So she's been an incredible figurehead. Now, she definitely approaches this from the left versus right framework. And the difference between her and Tallarico is that he tries to avoid as much as possible the left versus right framework. And I think Jasmine Crockett really dives into it and really owns it and says that we're going to win this. We're going to run the score with our voters, with our base in the big cities, perhaps in the suburbs where there's been a growing number of people that are voting Democrat. And we're just going to go all out. Now, Tallarico is talking about his election and his approach from a top versus bottom approach. And if you really think about it, this is very much an economic populist approach. So there's a reason Jasmine Crockett doesn't talk as much about economic populist messaging. She thankfully has talked about Medicare for all and talked about other populist messages that I think have been forced into the conversation for Democratic candidates right now, but hasn't talked about with the same veracity like Tallarico has in terms of going after the billionaire class, going after the people at the very top that are rigging the system that goes against everybody at the bottom, everybody in the middle class, everybody that's working class. We have a common enemy, and those are the billionaires. That is what Tallarico's message is, to try to cut across race, class, political party, rural versus urban, trying to cut across all of that. There's been we've been conditioned in many ways to believe that the only way to persuade red, conservative, rural voters to vote Democrat is to appeal to their conservatism or to their supposed conservatism. And so a left versus right framework may not be as effective with those voters, but you completely destroy that if you talk with a framework of top versus bottom, because now you're talking about the conditions, the economic needs that they have, the material conditions, the economic pain that everybody's feeling regardless of where they're at in Texas. We all have that in common. Rural Texas and these counties that vote very Republican experience cuts in healthcare. They also experience cuts in public schools. I'm not surprised that 30% of rural Republicans join Democrats, for example, in opposing these school vouchers. If anybody benefits from or expanded Medicaid or universal health care, it is rural Texans, because private medicine does not make any profit in rural areas just because it's so sparse. So if any benefits the most from public or government healthcare, it is rural America. And when you actually ask rural Americans that are consistently voting conservative or for Republicans, when you actually take away the R versus D in the conversation with them and you ask them if they agree with universal healthcare or public schools, overwhelmingly they do support these policies. And that is what the top versus bottom conversation approach allows you to have with voters across the state of Texas and, frankly, across the country. And so can it work for Tallarico if he wins this primary, goes into the November race and try to appeal to with voters all across? Perhaps. It's very possible. I don't think this was possible in 2024. The political conditions were just too nasty to be able to convince and persuade people at that time, especially with the Democrats being the incumbents in that race at the national, federal, at the presidential level. But now it's different. Now we're over a year into this Trump's administration, and he is very unpopular. And there's even a divide within MAGA, right? We're seeing massive political upsets in traditionally red ruby seats like Senate District 9 in North Texas, where a seat that Trump won by 17 points, Taylor Remmett, union machinist and union leader, was able to defeat the Republican there by 14 points in this very same district I mentioned that Trump won by 17. It's a huge upset, huge political earthquake. And so it was interesting to see that there was a 26-point swing of Latino voters into support of Democrats in that race, which could be highly indicative of what's going to happen across the state with Latinos in the midterm election in November. I think what's interesting to know, I would love to look and slice the numbers a little bit more, is how many people that had voted for Trump in 2024 voted for Taylor Remmett in 2026. That would be incredible information to know for candidates like James Talarico and Jasmine Crockett moving forward. Because if in fact there's even a tiny slice, if you're able to move red rural voters 3 to 5 points, that's a massive win for Democrats here in Texas. And I think that's possible this year because, like I said, Trump is incredibly unpopular this year. He's lost a narrative on immigration because of the ICE raids and the aggressive approach on that, on the economy with the tariffs. He's lost his narrative. Those were his two strongest points in getting elected, and it just hasn't worked out for him. And a lot of people are turning on him. So it'll be interesting to know how many of these independents are turning out in these Democratic primaries, how many of these Republican voters that voted for Republicans in the 2024 primary election or even voted for Trump are actually turning out in this Democratic primary, which could give us an indication if Talarico's approach could really cut across and get there in November. And good information for Jasmine Crockett to know if she in fact wins this primary, moving forward and expanding her strategy further out besides just expanding the electorate of low propensity voters, and perhaps in major metro areas or suburb areas across the state. So that's Talarico's approach. Taking it back to Jasmine Crockett's approach, like I mentioned, really running up the numbers in big cities. Now, historically, there has been a lot of efforts already put in big cities in Texas, in Harris County, in Houston, in Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, some of the border areas like Rio Grande Valley and El Paso. Now, has that strategy worked? It hasn't. The math hasn't added up. It just hasn't. And it doesn't add up because in some of these big cities, you're not really running up the score. In Houston, Democrats consistently win, but they're not running up the score. They're not winning those elections 2-1. It's more like 55-45. So you're able to increase the number of people voting in a place like Harris County and actually winning by a larger margin. Now we're possibly changing the equation here, and that could possibly be happening right now. So if that in fact is the political conditions that we're currently transforming into, then Jasmine Crockett has a winning strategy too. But we're seeing things potentially where both strategies combined could be successful at the same time, cutting across right now. It's like this shift. We saw this shift towards the right, 5-6 points towards Trump in the 2024 election. And suddenly it seems like there's this huge rebound coming back towards Democrats and even going even further left all across, right? So hopefully in counties that voted Republican 80-20, maybe it's 60-40 now, right? Maybe there's a chance for Democrats to at least compete in some of these more rural or small town areas in Texas instead of getting blown out. And it's important to think about Texas as a whole here, because when you think about small towns in rural Texas, it makes up about 25 to 30% of the electorate. And if you're getting blown out 80-20 in rural Texas and small towns, 80-20, those wins in those big cities don't seem as convincing anymore. You really have to run up the scores in those areas. But right now, I think we have a unique chance to both close the gap in rural Texas and small towns because of what we're seeing so far with the turnout. And at the same time, run up the score and turn out more people that are low propensity voters in the big cities. That combination could be historic here in Texas and will absolutely deliver the win for the Democratic candidate. And just one of those strategies could deliver the win if it's strong enough and if it's potent enough, right? But if you combine both of them, I think it's gravy. It's an easy win for Democrats in November. But I think it's absolutely important for the Democratic candidate to really embrace economic populism right now. It's a combination of keeping MAGA accountable, particularly right now that we're living through these Epstein files and the people at the very top that are getting away with breaking all these rules, is also attached to going after these billionaires that get away with all these rules, that rig the system to benefit themselves. And that's, I think, also the Talarico approach. So there's a lot here, but Democrats need to pick up 4 seats. They need to pick up 4 seats in the Senate to get a majority. So right now, I think it's 53-47. So 45 Democrats, 2 independents that caucus with Democrats, and then 53 Republicans. So right now, we're looking at Maine is very likely going to go to a Democrat there. We're looking at Sherrod Brown in Ohio coming back and having a shot at winning that Senate race there. We're looking at Alaska as a possibility, right? We're looking, I think, at North Carolina as a possibility, Iowa, and people are looking now at Texas because of what's going on right now with this historic voter turnout in this primary. So I encourage everybody to continue organizing, continue getting the word out. Right now, it's going to be super important to make sure that we keep a really close eye in the voting election process, especially in November. At the end of the day, we're still under the rule of a Republican supermajority here in Texas, and they're going to try to do everything in their power to win with anything that they have in their toolbox with voter suppression. So if you could volunteer with civic groups that are out there canvassing or out there watching or poll watching, making sure that everything's good, supporting people that are disabled that are trying to vote, Spanish speaking people, permanent residents that recently became citizens that are voting for the first time. There's so much and so many groups out there that are doing really incredible work. Civic groups, legal groups like Texas Civil Rights Project, the ACLU Texas, and just a flurry of groups, a network of groups out there that are going to be really engaged in elections throughout the rest of the year, but even more so in the November midterm election, because that's when the stakes are going to be extremely high, because that's when Trump is really going to feel threatened. And he's already talked about sending ICE to polling locations and trying to intimidate folks from voting. And they're proposing the SAVE Act, which doesn't have a shot because you need 60 votes in the Senate. But the fact that they're being that aggressive right now is a sign of them doing everything in their power, taking over election locations in Georgia with the FBI, just complete craziness going on right now. And so an election like this in Texas, this amount of people voting Democrat in this primary is certainly going to create a reaction from Trump. And I bet it's bugging them right now. It's freaking them out. But we talked about the Senate race, but there's certainly a lot of other races going on in Texas. We have the governor's race and primary congressional races going on. And we'll talk about that in another video. But for now, y'all take care. Have a good one.